All right, so if you spend enough time listening to various Catholic arguments for the papacy, then you'll know all too well that there is one church father who is eventually going to make his appearance in these types of discussions. And that one church father is Irenaeus. And honestly, I completely understand why that is. Like, if you ever get a chance to actually read Irenaeus's works against heresies, which I think it's a fantastic read, by the way. I was thinking about bringing it off my bookshelf to show y'all because I believe it looks just beautiful. But, I decided not to. I don't know why. But if you get a chance to read that book, then you'll see that he says some incredibly strong things about the Church of Rome, right? Strong enough, in fact, that I think there are a lot of Protestants who almost always get so nervous whenever his name comes up in these types of conversations and debates about the papacy, right? Some Protestants I've even saw will immediately try to start to weaken exactly what Irenaeus says. Others will basically shrug their shoulders and say, well, who cares what Irenaeus thought in this or that century or about this or that issues? We believe in sola scriptura, right? And so we can care less of what Irenaeus had to say. And although I understand the instinct behind that second response, I do not think that that is how Protestants should approach these conversations, should approach church history. Look, my friends, especially if you're Protestant out here, I want you to listen closely. Sola scriptura does not mean that we treat church history as if it is somehow irrelevant. It doesn't mean that we should not care about what Christians living relatively close to the apostolic era actually believe. And it certainly doesn't mean that whenever we encounter historical evidence that initially seems uncomfortable for our position, that we just somehow ignore it. Look, as Protestants, we should be the first ones to be quick to acknowledge that Irenaeus is an important historical witness, right? That means if he says something strong about Rome, then guess what? Let him say that strong thing about Rome. It is okay. There is nothing that Irenaeus says here and against heresies that poses any kind of problem for us as Protestants. Like, there is literally nothing to be afraid of if you take the time and actually read and understand exactly what he says and think critically about this whole situation and how it relates to this whole situation. Now, I already know that that is a very, very bold claim, but I assure you that you're going to see exactly why I made it in just a little bit. I'm going to demonstrate that for you. And so what I want to do in this video is not try to rescue Protestantism from Irenaeus as if we really needed any rescuing to begin with. Rather, what I want us to do is just slow the conversation down and begin to ask ourselves whether we are actually allowing the historical evidence to establish only what it can establish. Because, what I've kind of noticed is that what typically happens in these conversations is that people begin to see how strongly Irenaeus speaks about Rome. And, they immediately jump from that historical testimony all the way, like it's just going across the moon, across the galaxy, if you will, to the later Catholic doctrine of the papacy. And my friends, if you were to do that, then you are not thinking critically here, because even if I were to grant you every single strong thing that Irenaeus says about the Church of Rome, it still would not get you to the Vatican I's understanding of the papacy. And you know what? This is actually probably a good opportunity, a good place to just remind you exactly what Rome is ultimately claiming here, because I think a lot of people tend to get amnesia as it relates to the vast and bold claims of Rome, that you honestly, kind of gloss over it. And that's a mistake, because you need to understand what Rome is actually claiming. You see, their claim is not merely that the Church of Rome became, extremely important very early on in church history. Or it's not that Rome possessed influence at one point of time, even great influence at one point in time in church history. Or it's not that other Christians grew to love and respect the Church of Rome for one reason or another. No, none of those are the actual official claims of Rome. Vatican I's claim is ultimately that Christ himself instituted a unique office in Peter, that this Petrine office was intended to continue in Peter's successors at Rome, and that the Bishop of Rome possesses supreme authority over the entire universal church, and that under particular conditions, this office enjoys divine protection from doctrinal error. That, my friends, is what Rome is claiming. They are claiming that Christ instituted all of those things of which I just mentioned. And to be honest, that should really be your first red flag in this conversation, because I don't know how you can read Irenaeus, who, by the way, lived in the 2nd century, and come away with the understanding that he's going to help Catholics establish any one of those claims, right? Those are claims that we have to find in the apostolic era itself. But you know what? I even digress on that point, because that's a conversation for another day. Right now, what I want us to do is just keep the Vatican I claim in the back of our minds, because that is ultimately the threshold that we're going to have to get across if we're going to believe in the Vatican I idea of the papacy. Now, just so that nobody misunderstands me here, I already know that Catholics are going to tell me, they're probably going to run to the comment section and say that, well, Janai, you have to understand that Irenaeus isn't the entire case for the papacy. Come on now, you know this. And that's true. I will, make sure that the audience knows that, this is certainly not what Catholics are saying, right? I know that they are going to want to turn your attention and appeal to places like Matthew chapter 16 and Luke 22 and John 21 and, all of those things of that sort. None of which, by the way, says anything remotely concerning the papacy. But that is neither here nor there, right? Again, conversation for another day. However, it should be noted that I completely understand that Irenaeus, for Catholics, is just one piece to the larger puzzle as it relates to the papacy, right? And so I am certainly not going to argue in this video that if Irenaeus does not personally give us every single component that would later be articulated at Vatican I, then the papacy is automatically disproven. Nope, that's not my position. That would be way too simplistic. And if a Protestant was to take that position, Catholics, go ahead and dunk on them, right? You have the right to do that. Rather, the question that I want to ask in this video is actually much narrower. What does Irenaeus actually tell us about Rome? And how far can that historical testimony legitimately take us toward the claim that the papacy itself is of divine institution? Because, my friends, that is the central question of this video. That is what we're ultimately trying to figure out. All right, so with that whole entire framework in place, let's actually begin to look at what Irenaeus exactly says. And the passage that everybody typically goes to is in Against Heresies, book 3, chapter 3. Again, fantastic book. You should actually go and read it whenever you get a chance. And before we even look at what he says here in regards to Rome, I actually want to cover the larger context, because I think that's really important. And I've noticed that all too often, it kind of gets glossed over in these conversations. You see, my friends, if you haven't read the book, just to let you in on the context for a moment, Irenaeus is actually arguing against the Gnostics, who, if you don't know who they are a group of people that claim that they had possessed hidden apostolic teaching that had been passed down secretly through selected individuals. And Irenaeus' response to the Gnostics is basically the opposite of what they're claiming, right? His argument is that, apostolic Christianity is public. It's visible, right? You can look at the churches that were founded by the apostles. You can look at what those churches teach. You can look at their succession list. You can compare and contrast that public teaching with what the Gnostics were postulating at that particular time. Right. And that's actually what leads Irenaeus to say that, if he wanted to, he could actually go through the succession list of all of the apostolic churches. But because, of course, that would take way too long to do, he chooses Rome specifically as his main example. And then, of course, that's when he goes on to describe the Church of Rome as being very great and very ancient and very universally known as a church. Right. And he connects its establishment with both Peter and Paul, which is very interesting. We're going to come back to that in just a moment, right? He gives its succession list of bishops as he promised, and he treats Rome as a major public witness to apostolic teaching. And then, of course, we get to the moment of truth. We get to the famous statement that because of Rome's preeminence, it was necessary for every church to commandeer with it. And, of course, it's that last part that really perks up Catholics' ears whenever they hear it, right? A lot of them hear that and immediately say, aha, you see, that's proof of papal supremacy or papal infallibility or whatever the case may be. And, this is actually where I just want to say to them, hold on there, Jethro. I think you're moving way too fast for us. And one of the reasons that I know you're moving way too fast is because, unfortunately, many people do not stop to acknowledge that there is actually a textual issue in regards to Irenaeus' statement here about every church needing to commandeer with Rome. You see, for those who don't know, again, this is kind of technical, so hang with me here. The original Greek for this part in Against Heresies has not survived. We do not have it, right? And so essentially what we're doing is we're working from an ancient Latin translation. And so because of that, there has been so much debate over exactly how strongly certain words in this sentence should be rendered. You see, some translations take commandeer in the sense of every church needing, right, to agree with Rome. Others take it in the more of a sense of resorting to Rome, coming together with Rome, or converging upon Rome, right? And so as you can see, those are two very different ideas. One is clearly way stronger than the other ones. And, I think this is actually a really good place, a really good opportunity to kind of model for a lot of you how careful historical interpretation should actually work. You see, in historical interpretation, if the wording itself in a historical document carries some level of uncertainty, we should not automatically try to grab the strongest possible reading simply because it gives our theology the most mileage in these debates and conversations. No, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to start with what the evidence securely establishes. Then, and only then, if the stronger reading is possible, then that's when you acknowledge that too, right? That's what we should be doing because that's what careful and good historians actually do. But you know what? Even with that, all that being said, I'm not actually going to build my argument on the weaker reading here. I just wanted to note that for you because that's typically glossed over in these conversations because, again, most people are moving way too fast, right? And so for the sake of argument, let's actually grant the stronger reading of Irenaeus' words here. Let's say that Irenaeus is really saying that every church must agree with Rome by necessity because Rome possesses preeminent authority. All right, cool. We've granted that. We've got that. Okay, now that we've documented everything that Irenaeus says about Rome, now we have to ask ourselves a very key question. What conclusions does that historical testimony actually warrant for us to take away, warrant us to believe? You see, that's the central question at hand. And this is actually where I think we really have to slow down the most because, again, I think a lot of people kind of forget exactly who Irenaeus was. Like sometimes what I've noticed with engaging with different Catholics and Orthodox online in the comment section, whatever the case may be, what I've kind of noticed is that I find myself needing to remind Catholics and Orthodox who Irenaeus and the rest of these church fathers actually are. Like they're not infallible. They're not inspired. They are, to all of us, important historical witnesses. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. And so what their historical testimony gives us most securely, especially as it relates to Irenaeus, is evidence for how he understood the Church of Rome in his own day. And look, I want to be very, very clear here. That's not nothing. But at the same time, that's not everything either. And we have to be comfortable with acknowledging that. We have to acknowledge that there's a massive difference between saying Irenaeus believed this thing about Rome and saying Christ divinely established this arrangement, this understanding, this development of Roman preeminence and supremacy and all the other stuff, right? Because those are two totally different claims, my friends. I have to say that because, again, this is precisely where people often move way too quickly. People kind of get excited and they're like, ooh, Irenaeus said this cool thing about Rome. Let's start to run with it. Let's start to just, go to the moon and back with it, right? No, you got to slow down. For example, let's start with the fact that Irenaeus clearly believed that Rome is preeminent, right? All right, cool. We've got that. But now we have to ask the more important question, which is why, right? Why does Irenaeus believe Rome is preeminent? Is it because it's association with both Peter and Paul, two apostles, which, by the way, at that particular time, not many apostolic churches can claim that, right? Is it because of that? Is it because it was located at the very center of the Roman Empire? That's a pretty good reason. Is it because it was one of the largest and most visible churches in the entire Christian world? Is it because it had developed an unusually strong reputation for preserving orthodoxy? Those two could be possible readings or possible understandings. Is it because Christians from all over the empire were constantly coming into contact with Rome? Is it because it possessed some kind of genuine primatial authority? Or is it because Rome is right and Christ actually did give Peter universal jurisdiction over the whole entire church, and that jurisdiction became uniquely attached to the Roman episcopate? Look, my friends, maybe that last explanation is the correct one. I fully acknowledge that that's a possibility. But you know what the problem is? The problem is that Irenaeus doesn't tell us which explanation that I just gave you is the correct explanation. All we have is his historical witness without the theological reasoning to back it. And look, that is very, very important because I don't know if you know this, but Rome was not actually the first church to be established, nor was it the first church to be associated with Peter. Jerusalem was. Jerusalem had Peter. Jerusalem had the 12. It was where the church was first publicly established in Acts chapter 2. And it's even where the first church council convened in Acts chapter 15. Look, if any church had bragging rights, it was the church in Jerusalem. And so if Rome eventually came to occupy this extraordinary position in the early church, then that historical development, that historical movement from the church in Jerusalem to the church of Rome, that needs to be explained. That needs to be articulated. And we need to look into that, right? Because when Paul was talking about, him needing to go and meet up with the other apostles and things of that nature, notice he didn't say, I went up to the church of Rome. No, he mentioned that he went up to the church in Jerusalem. Okay. And so you have to be able to demonstrate how this transition happened. You can't merely assume it. But you know what? Let's keep working through what Irenaeus says here, because I know that this is where most Catholics are going to want to remind me that he said that every church must agree with Rome as a matter of necessity, which, is a very big deal. And so the question that they would kind of pose to me is that, what would you do with that, Chennai? Like, how are you going to explain that away? Well, first, I would let you know that I'm not looking to explain anything away. Rather, I just take what he says at face value, right? By the looks of it, what I can confidently say in regards to Irenaeus' words there is that it tells us, at least on that reading, that Irenaeus clearly thought that Rome had, some kind of normative role for the other churches. But you know what? It's even here that we still have to ask those pesky central questions that I keep bringing up over and over and over again, because, that's what good historians do, which is, why does he believe that? And what exactly does that quote establish for us? Does it tell us why Rome had that authority? No. Does it tell us that Irenaeus derived this understanding from Matthew 16 or Luke 22 or John 21? No. Does it tell us that the Bishop of Rome is divinely protected from doctrinal error? No. Okay, so once again, it looks like Irenaeus has consistently given us the that, but he does not necessarily give us the why. And the why is what we really need, my friends. And I think that distinction is one of the most important things that people really need to understand, people really need to grasp as they engage in historical theology. My friends, as you are looking through these primary sources, you cannot move from this was a situation in the late 2nd century to therefore this situation was divinely instituted by Christ. No, my friends, you can't do that. That bridge has to be built. It has to be established. You can't just skip over to this and be like, oh, the only explanation is that Christ actually established this. No, that is sloppy reasoning. And you know, the same thing is true whenever we get to this succession list. Like, sure, it is true that Irenaeus gives us a list of Roman bishops as part of his defense against the Gnostics. But again, returning back to that question, why does he do that? Well, remember, he actually tells us this one. It's because it would take way too long to do it for everyone. And so he does it with the most prominent church at the time, the church that he views as preeminent. Now, is that nothing? No. But is that everything either? No. Okay. All it tells us is that Rome was preeminent, and this was the most expedient, easy church to do that, right? And I want to call back to something that was actually very important. I want you to notice that part of the reason why he views Rome as being preeminent, right, and the reason why he chooses to provide the succession list for Rome is precisely because it was established by 2 apostles, right? By Peter and Paul. And I want you to notice that, right? Notice how he doesn't just say Peter, right? He doesn't say Peter established the church at Rome. He says Peter and Paul, right, established a single bishop of Rome, who then went on to pass down his office, his bishopric office, to successive bishops, right? That's it. That's all that was established here. And look, if you want to say that this succession is specifically succession to Peter's universal jurisdiction, then my friends, you still have to establish several additional things, right? That cannot just be assumed. You have to establish that Peter possessed such a universal office in the first place. You have to establish that Christ intended that office to continue after Peter's death. You have to establish that the office became uniquely attached to Rome. And you have to establish that the bishops of Rome inherited that particular office rather than simply succeeding to the episcopal ministry of the Roman Church, right? You have to establish all of those different premises. None of those premises just come to you for free just because Irenaeus gives us a succession list. My friends, that is his sloppy historical reasoning. And you know, then we actually get to what I think is probably the biggest hinge of all. You see, even if I grant all of this, even if I grant you the strongest reading of every single thing that we mentioned, I'm still left with the biggest question that I've been investigating in multiple videos as I've been looking into the papacy and specifically Vatican I's claims, which is, where is this divine protection from binding error? Because again, think about how much I'm willing to grant here. I'm willing to grant the preeminence. I'm willing to grant the necessity to agree with Rome. I'm willing to grant every single one aspect of this. Let's say I grant all of that. Guess what? We still need to answer one big question. Can Rome bind the church to error? Right? Now, I want you to notice how we still don't have an answer to that question. Now, I know that this is probably where a Catholic would want to remind me that Irenaeus doesn't possess the full case for the papacy or papal infallibility. And look, I get that, right? I understand that. But at the same time, this is also where I would want to remind you that if you cannot establish papal infallibility from Matthew 16, from Luke 22, from John 16, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then Irenaeus really doesn't get us any closer to substantiating Vatican I's claim. All he has given us so far is some good historical testimony that Rome has, developed into this very preeminent church at that particular time. But he doesn't tell us why, right? And he certainly doesn't tell us that this was of divine establishment. Now, I already know the common objection that some Catholics are going to want to raise here, right? Some Catholics are probably going to say something like, okay, Janai, but come on, right? Aren't you being a little too skeptical here? Aren't you being a little too rigorous with your historical reasoning? Like, if Irenaeus believed all of this, and if a significant number of Christians around his time also recognized Rome as having this kind of preeminence and needing to agree with it, then surely that has to count for something. And look, I agree. That does count for something. I'm not discounting that. I'm just pointing out the obvious, which is that it tells us nothing as to if Christ actually promised this, any of this in the first place, and especially this charism of infallibility in the first place, right? You see, plausibility, my friends, is not the same thing as demonstration, right? Just because it's plausible that Christ could have established something, that doesn't mean that he did. Like, come on, guys, we know this. In fact, we see very early on in the very apostolic era, these churches starting to drift into other things that were clearly not apostolic, right? We get this. Just because something appeared very early, just because something developed very early in church history, that does not mean it was established by Christ, right? You see, this is why I keep telling everybody to slow down, because I want y'all to remind y'all, I want to remind y'all that we're not merely talking about, or trying to figure out how great Rome was in the year 180 or something to that effect. No, we're asking, what did Christ himself establish? What did he institute? Like, the stakes are really, really high here, my friends, which means that we should be even more cautious with our historical reasoning, not less. Because if I'm going to tell Christians, as Rome does, that Jesus himself established an office to which the entire church must submit all of their will and authority to, then I want to have a very, very good reason for saying that, right? I shouldn't have to rely on taking a historical plausibility and then trying to turn it into a divine command. Like, no, that's dangerous, right? And God was very, very clear about what he would do if you were to put words in his mouth. And my friends, it ain't good, right? And so this is where I just want to reason with my Catholic friends for just a moment, because I got to say this, right? I know some of you aren't going to like me saying it, but I have to say it. I don't really think many of you have truly wrestled with, have truly considered both possibilities here. You see, it's true. Maybe Irenaeus really is preserving something that goes all the way back to the apostles. Maybe he does believe Rome is preeminent and important because this was the one true church and this is where the Pope resides, right? Maybe that is the case. That's certainly a possibility, right? But on the other hand, maybe that's not the case. Maybe it's the case that some degree of ecclesiastical development had already taken place by the late 2nd century. Maybe Rome's unique geographical position played a key role in all of this. Maybe its tie to two apostles gave it a significant advantage over the other apostolic churches. Maybe this is the why behind Irenaeus' claims, right? That's certainly possible too, right? And you certainly can't dismiss my list of explanations while holding to yours when we literally have the same amount of data for both of them, which is nothing, right? Do you see what I mean? Now, I know people are probably going to push back and try to tell me that, no, Janai, you're wrong. This is still very early in church history. There's no way that the church could develop this much, this fast. And again, this is where I would tell everybody, oh my goodness, go read your Bibles. Like, what do you think the apostles were doing through all those letters, right? The church was already trying to develop super, super fast, and they were trying to slow that thing down, right? But, I'll be honest. I find this objection to be quite naive because it kind of acts like a substantial amount of time has not passed by the time Irenaeus was writing. Like, guys, we are talking a little more than a century here. Like, sometimes as it feels like, many of my Catholic and Orthodox friends, they kind of act like 10 years or a century is like 10 years or something. Like, no, a century is a century, right? History does not all of a sudden work differently just because we put the label early church on it or the patristic era over a particular period of time. Like, no, time does not work like that, my friends. Like, just think about how much America has changed within a century. Right. I mean, we've had multiple historical institutional changes. Right. We've seen authority structures develop. We've seen practices expand. We've seen ways of describing things shift. I mean, all of that happened within like 50 years. Right. Let alone 100. And sure, I'll admit that proximity certainly gives Irenaeus substantial evidential weight compared to someone, let's say, in the 8th century has. But still, even here, it does not give him infallibility. It does not give him inspiration, which is kind of what you need if you want to derive anything past what Irenaeus gives you here. And so because he is not those things, this is why we must continue to go back to that which is inspired, to that which is infallible, to answer the why questions that Irenaeus simply doesn't give us here, right? This is where we have to go back to Matthew chapter 16, which I have a video on. We have to go back to Luke 22, which I also have a video on. We have to go back to John 21, which I still need to make a video on to see if they actually establish the premises that get us to Vatican I papacy, right? And look, if any or all of those texts independently or collectively establish a unique Petrine office, then sure, Irenaeus definitely becomes very interesting historical cooperation. I'm not denying that, right? Because now his high view of Rome actually fits into an already established theological framework that we were able to derive from Matthew 16, Luke 22, John 21, you name it. But what you cannot do is go from Irenaeus to the biblical text and then back to Irenaeus, right? You can't say, well, Irenaeus believed Rome was preeminent, Janai. Therefore, Matthew 16 must be teaching the papacy here. And then say, well, Matthew 16 teaches the papacy. Therefore, that must be why Irenaeus believed Rome was preeminent. No, my friends, that's stupid and that's circular, right? We have to deal with the biblical text first because the biblical text comes first, right? And so if the biblical text establish the Petrine office, they have to establish it on their own terms, right? Then and only then can Irenaeus corroborate it. But Irenaeus cannot be used to manufacture the very premises that are then brought back to interpret him. And no, that is not me arguing like an atheist or being stubborn with the historical data. This is just what careful historians and theologians do, my friends. It's okay. If Rome's claims are true, then guess what? You don't need to sweat the process. You'll be fine. But if it's not true, then yeah, you have every right to sweat this process because it starts to get a little bit more uncomfortable for Catholics. But as a Protestant, look, I'm chilling. I'm not sweating one bit because nothing that Irenaeus has said here gets us any closer to the papacy, right? Especially if Matthew 16, Luke 22, John 21 doesn't really tell us anything about the papacy or even papal infallibility, right? But all right, guys, that's the video. Look, if you enjoyed this video, please do me a favor, like, share, subscribe, do all that good stuff, as it really does help the channel a lot. By the way, shout out to those people who have been helping me with my camera issues. I know the footage has been looking a little bit blurry. Hopefully this comes out looking a lot better. And so I really do appreciate y'all helping me out. Your feedback is very much appreciated. But with all that being said, until next time, guys, peace.